Hi, and welcome back to Continual. Tonight, we are going to be talking about one of those great histories with fandom, folklore, and fantasy, none other than J.R.R. Tolkien. But before we dive into that tonight, I'm your host, Jim Nettles, and let's go around the room and see who's going to be joining us for this conversation. So, Beth, being the first time, we're going to have you go first.
Hi, I'm Beth Dolgner. I write paranormal fiction and nonfiction. So my worlds are very different from the worlds of Tolkien's, but my brain kind of goes on vacation in Middle Earth. I read The Lord of the Rings annually, and his worlds are things that just really mean a lot to me.
Ed?
Hi, I'm Ed McKeown, science fiction author in Charlotte, North Carolina, writing primarily science fiction and urban fantasy. Kind of like Beth, I have an annual touch-in with The Lord of the Rings, which I've been reading for many decades now, and love as much now as I did when I first met it.
Jay?
Hi, everyone. I'm J.R.R. I'm an author of epic fantasy and sword and sorcery. My latest release is A Wave of Lions by Falstaff Books, which you can find at all major booksellers. Thank you for having me.
And Mark?
My name is Mark West. I am an actual academic. I'm an English professor at UNC Charlotte, where I've been in my 38th year of being a professor there. But I have taught Tolkien in various courses over the years. In fact, my introduction to really immersing myself in Tolkien was when I was a graduate student and found out that I was assigned to teach an entire class devoted entirely to Tolkien. So that's when I first learned about the fandom as it relates to this particular author. And I followed his career over the years in terms of what he wrote. Although I have to say that my specialty is children's literature and adolescent literature. So unlike many people, my favorite of the books is actually The Hobbit, but I know The Lord of the Rings well too.
So let's actually start by, since we're here for fandom, let's start talking about where everybody got introduced to Tolkien. And so when we look at Tolkien, my first real introduction, I was probably 8 or 9 years old, and my aunt and uncle gave me their well-worn copies of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And in fact, I meant to dig one of them out today because they're all sitting over here on the shelf, but they were already well-worn by the time I got them. And I've put a few more miles on them myself. So Beth, how about you? How did you get introduced into this world?
Weirdly enough, with a calendar. When I was a kid, my mother had a calendar for the old animated movie. And I just remember those images like of Smaug and of Bilbo. And I always meant to go and read The Hobbit and read The Lord of the Rings. And when I heard they were making movies of The Lord of the Rings, I said, okay, I have to read the books before I go see the movies. And so that's what finally spurred me into action.
How about you, Ed?
Well, I was kind of a bookish, shy child, and I remember being at an away camp, probably when I was like 12 or so, and somebody had the Fellowship of the Ring in the original kind of weird down, and started reading it, and then found out that there was more and devoured the entire trilogy in short order. I think I'd read the trilogy twice before I found The Hobbit. Jarred by the difference between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, but it was an early friendship.
How about you, Jay?
So really the beginning of my journey as a fantasy reader and as eventually a fantasy author starts with my dad handing me his copy of The Hobbit. This is literally the one that he grew up with. So it's kind of just been the beginning of my fandom in fantasy in general. So I've been a fan since I was 11, and I've read everything ever since, and I'm absolutely in love with the world.
How about you, Mark?
Well, I during the 1960s and early 70s, when the hippie movement was in full sway, the Tolkien was really a number then. People were really, he was really having a moment at that point. When the books came out, when Lord of the Rings came out in the 50s, they really weren't bestsellers or anything when they first came out, but they really caught on in the 60s. And so when I was in high school, a lot of my friends were really into it. I read, when I was in high school, I read The Hobbit and I liked it a lot. And then I picked up The Lord of the Rings. And frankly, when I was 16 years old, I really didn't like The Lord of the Rings. It was a little too ponderous to me. And I missed the humor. The Hobbit has a lot of humor, and I miss the humor. I like humor in my stories. But then when I was in college, I gave The Lord of the Rings a second chance, and I grew to really like it. But my first taste of Lord of the Rings, I wasn't as enamored with it as some people were back in the day. And then when I really began to learn a lot about it was when I was in graduate school and I had a teaching assistantship, and I would teach introduction to literature courses. And I normally would teach a course on fantasy literature. And so I kind of turned it into, I taught things like Lewis Carroll and stuff like that. But then one day I looked at my teaching schedule and it said, you're going to be teaching 2 sections of Tolkien. At that point, I'd never taught it before. So that was that experience of teaching those courses and seeing the students in the course. The students, and I have a whole bunch of stories about that experience, but I taught 2 sections of it back to back. Neat, and then I'd have a 10-minute break, and then I'd teach the exact same thing in the exact same classroom all over again. And half the students in that class were utter fanatics, and they knew a lot more about the book than I did because they were just immersed in it. And some of the students were just looking for a class that looked like it would be easy credits and kind of fun, and knew nothing about it. So it was kind of an interesting mix, but that was really my introduction to fandom, was that experience of having students in my class who truly were fanatical. I didn't usually have in my other courses, this is a long time ago, this is over 40 years ago. But I didn't usually have that kind of fanatical response to people who might have read, Alice Adventures in Wonderland or something.
Well, and so when I first started reading Tolkien, one of the things that jumped out at me, and of course, this is, they were written to be children's books. That was the targeted audience at the time. And, obviously a lot of the language is a product of the time, but the thing that really pulled me in, and I've read a lot of books and stories read through a long period of time. So, I mean, I'm used to reading language from different periods and looking at the influences and looking at the language, and being that Tolkien was a linguistic scholar himself, and the languages he created, the language is the first thing that really pulled me in. The fantastical elements were fun and all of that, but really it was the creation of the language, syntax, and all that sort of stuff that pulled me in, even at that young of an age. So Ed, what was it for you? I mean, when you picked up the book, was it the thing that you said, okay, I really do need to dive into this more?
I was attracted by the characters and the interrelationships. I think as a young person, I was probably like at the time, you're always looking for someone to hold yourself. And for me, that the big model, Aragorn, they were influenced. They were people that you admired, that you would like to be like. So you had that, and then you had the intense friendship among the members, particularly of the Fellowship, and that was something I found very attractive as well.
How about you, Jay?
I think the real draw for me, when I was 11, I was smaller than most boys, and you often don't get picked to go out and play and do all those things. So the story of a wizard showing up on your doorstep and drawing you into an adventure that you don't think you're worthy for, but you learn along the way that you are, had a real draw for me as a really young child. I think another important part of it was Tolkien still, to me, has this way with language and his style of writing and his ability to translate a story, which I agree is often cumbersome and sometimes ponderous. But there's still something electric about just the world he creates and the atmosphere he's able to create in those books. It's still unlike most things I've read to this day.
How about you, Mark? Other than, that being told that you're going to be teaching class in it, what is it about?
I love the world building. I think that he is a master at world building. And if you get into the stories, you really feel like you're there, like Middle Earth is a real place, with a history, with a botany, with a geology, with with languages and maps, and you can follow along. When I taught my course, I still remember I had students that were into maps. And so we took over one corner of the chalkboard. That was back before people did all of this technological stuff. And we kept a map for the entire course where they were going. And the students that were into the map were really into it. They would draw, forests and stuff like that. It was more than just a little, it was a quarter of the chalkboard. But luckily nobody erased it over the whole course. So I still remember that. But the world building, he was a master at that. And I think other people who've come along to do this kind of high fantasy sort of writing have really learned at his feet in terms of how to create a believable, fully developed, rich world. To me, the characters are interesting. I like the characters, but it's the world building. Yeah, I think for me, I wanted to be there. It's not so much that I didn't really want to be Frodo or Bilbo or any of the characters. I just wanted to be in Middle Earth. That to me was what was the great appeal. And I think that in my interactions with fans related to this whole world, I think for a lot of them, that's what they want. They want to be in the world. And you can feel like you're in the world because it's just so richly developed.
How about you, Beth? Especially if you have to pick it up every year, there's got to be something that pulls you back to it every time.
Well, I certainly agree with what everybody else has said, but I think one of the things for me that's most significant is, for me, it's a message of hope. I mean, it's a very hopeful, Lord of the Rings is very hopeful that, even in dark times, there are still good things to be found, and dark times are not forever. So even though everybody doesn't necessarily get the happily ever after they wanted, still the overall message, I think, is something that's very special to me. And I think that kind of in that same vein, yes, it's a fantasy novel, it's a fantasy world, and yet there's a lot that's relatable to us in our own world, I think, with just, that message of perseverance and getting through it and doing what you have to do and carrying on. So I've always found it to be sort of a comforting read, which is partly why I say that my brain vacations in Middle Earth. It's that break and that reassurance that I need from time to time.
Yeah,
I'd have to say that one thing that I might disagree a little bit with folks is I have not found the writing, and I'm actually rereading it presently, ponderous. It is a more formal English than we usually read, but I, just entered the book and I've slid along the words, like they were greased lightning. The books, to me, I read very fast, and there's beautiful descriptive passages in it. So yeah, I can see where some folks might find it ponderous. I would say that's not my own experience.
Well, I found it that way when I was like 17, 16, when I first read. I didn't find Hobbit that way at all. But I remember when my first introduction to Lord of the Rings, I felt like somebody described it. They went up a hill and they went down a hill. And then they went up a hill and then they went down a hill. And then they went up a hill and then they went down a hill. And it just seemed like, come on, let's get along with this. But then, as I said, with a little bit more sophistication, some years later, I noticed that they were doing things besides going up a hill and downhill. And I became more immersed in it. But that wasn't my first introduction to it. My first introduction was oh, this book takes itself way too seriously. That's how I felt about it. I didn't feel that way about The Hobbit because Tolkien can be funny, and kind of dry British wit, but and it's just, I don't know what happened. And also, in teaching, I mostly teach women. Most of my students are women in my classes. 80, 90, 95% of my students are women. And I've always found that a little tricky in terms of teaching anything related to Tolkien, because it's such a male world. I mean, one of the things that when Peter Jackson decided to make it into movies, like, I got to find some minor female character, make her into a real character, because I have to have some kind of female representation in this book. And so I don't know if my 17-year-old self was picking up on that, but that was something that I wish that he had been more gender inclusive.
So I will say he doesn't have a lot of female characters, but the ones he does have are fierce, and I love them.
Galadriel, Mcewen, and yeah, you're also asking perhaps a lot of a World War I era Don from Oxford.
Well, if I may say, I think one thing about the books that make them special is that as the reader ages, you can find new things in them as you read along.
Good point.
Now, I've heard a lot of people from the 11 to about 18 range who read these books really do find, like, The Two Towers, for example, can be a really long read, especially when they start traveling through so many different geographies. And Tolkien really does kind of truncate the second book. The third book, too, a lot of people that are younger don't initially get why the journey of Frodo and Sam is so special. It translates, I think it translates a little bit better in the film. But I think as you follow those readers as they get older and they reread the books, slowly, like, as you say, it's not just going up and down hills. They start picking up on certain things. For example, all of us here are fans of The Hobbit. Tolkien was really careful to make sure that he wasn't writing what he considered allegory. But I think we all know, as we read the style of his writing and the stories that he was telling, certain things peek in, like World War I. There is a scene in The Hobbit where Bilbo has escaped Erebor with the Arkenstone, and he's running to the elves and the men of Lake Town, and I don't know if someone else had shown up by then. It's been a few years since I've read The Hobbit. I apologize.
Gandalf was there.
Gandalf was there. But if you read that, there's this passage that I didn't understand until I was in my 30s, where you finally see the transformation of Bilbo from the person that's sitting on the front porch of his Hobbit home to someone who is kind of turned into this kind of marauder, an actual burglar in the night, running through the forest, trying to, complete this breakneck, desperate mission, in some ways to start a war, to stop a war and end the violence in his mind. Tolkien may have not been writing allegory, but you see the kind of person I think Bilbo becomes, mature, and with the reader too, I think the way we interpret these characters just matures along the way. And of course, the appreciation of the writing, as Ed mentions, because, I agree with him. Now that I am older, I still find that Tolkien's style is great and it's fluid and it delivers a lot of impact. But I have to admit, when I was in high school and I was in college a little bit, there would be a few pages that I would skip because I already read them and I knew, they were going to go up a hill and down a hill.
The songs and the poems.
Yeah.
Well, and so if we take a look at, and I want to talk a little bit more about the world building, because I think that's what really, if we look at the films, we look at the upcoming TV series, even if we go back to the animated series that was done back in the 70s, all these different ones, one of the things that connects us, and in not only in Tolkien's work himself, but all the stuff he's influenced, it's the world he built that carries over into pretty much all of fantasy genre. It carries over into so much of gaming. I mean, if you look, D&D is almost, we may as well go ahead and call it gaming in Mordor. So
It's
I mean,
become the default fantasy world for all of high, high fantasy, high sword sorcery fantasy.
Guilty. Guilty. Yeah, like that. There's no denying that the world building of Tolkien has influenced, in some ways, kind of since the publishing of the series, and of course the Unfinished Tales. He has really kind of dominated how we formulate fantasy still to this day.
Sure.
Even his critics, and I read a lot of Tolkien criticism, especially over the last few years. Even his critics will acknowledge, like, the structures that we use in fantasy literature to build worlds, we still take a lot of structures from him. Though there are other authors out there that we also take structures from. Like I'm a quote unquote Le Guinist. I'm a big fan of Ursula K. Le Guin. I think she had a very unique way of world building that's also influenced fantasy. Robert E. Howard, of course, from Conan the Barbarian. But if you really look at epic fantasy in general still, Tolkien still has this overwhelming influence upon how worlds are shaped and built.
Hello, I'm John L. French, ex-crime scene investigator for Baltimore City, now writer and editor, and longtime Tolkien fan.
So we're coming in and talking a little bit about world building, and because again, I think that the huge influences we see from world building on pretty much everything in fantasy and high fantasy. What are the elements that speak to you the most as really driving and being the core of, well, really of Middle Earth? What's the thing that speaks to you most in terms of that world building? Is it the very active and living world itself? Is it more about the politics? Is it about the culture? What is it in that all of that world building that speaks to you the most? So John, since you're joining us now, I'll let you take that one on.
What first attracted me to Tolkien and Lord of the Rings was the sheer scope of the adventure. And this is back when I was in college, and I had already read The Hobbit, and back then UMBC had what was called mini-mesters during during January. And one of the mini-mester courses was Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings. So I took that course, and just I had never read anything like it. It was an all-encompassing world with its own legends and songs and mythology. And it was just something that drove me into reading the stuff before this, like Lord Dunsany, and reading things afterwards. I probably would not have read Glenn Cook's The Black Company had it not been for Tolkien. And now it seems like whenever I pick up a fantasy novel, these novels would not have been written had it not, well, maybe they would have been written in a way, but they would not have been written the way they were had it not been for Tolkien setting up what is basically the rules.
How about you, Beth? What is it in the world building? What is it in the universe that you really pulls you in?
I think there's two things I really like. One is just the casual references he throws in to things that if you're just picking up Lord of the Rings for the first time, you have no idea what they mean. Like they'll reference like the Valar or something like that. And you're like, okay, I don't know what that is. But what it does for me is it says, this is an established world. They have their customs, they have their spiritual beliefs. And so you kind of know that. So I think it adds to the authenticity. And certainly after reading the Silmarillion and then going back and rereading the Lord of the Rings, a lot of those references make sense. But I feel like even if you don't have that background, it still adds to the believability of the world and the depth of the world. The other thing that I really like is that, yes, it's this high fantasy world, but it's also in decay. We see so many of these places that have passed out of their glory years and are now in ruin. And I think there's something that was an interesting choice that Tolkien made to do it that way, and instead of to join the story when these places were at the height of their power, like Gondor, for instance.
How about you, Jay?
I would actually like to add on to something Beth said earlier. One thing that I like that's inherent to the world building is, it's not just light versus dark, it's hope versus darkness. Because there is this constant sway of temptation that every character has to face at some point along their journey. And it doesn't matter if it's Aragorn or Hurin or name any character. Tolkien really writes his characters who have this struggle, moral and ethically, along the way. And even though they sometimes struggle, they sometimes fail, there's this kind of idea that darkness will be defeated if we just hold the courage and hope and we don't give up. And I think that's a very important part of the world, because it sets not only the tenor of it, but the entire theme throughout the entire series and all the world building itself. I think Tolkien was really trying, if you go and read his biography and some of his letters, there were really times in his life where he was kind of afflicted by some deep depressions, and that was probably a lot of PTSD due to World War I. Of course, he was at the Battle of the Somme and lost all of his friends during the conflict, all of his college friends that he went to school with. I think that hope is something that is desperately integral to Middle Earth, and without it, everything just kind of doesn't work. I think the world building is fueled by this notion.
How about you, Mark?
Well, one of the things that we haven't talked about as much that has really drawn me is the author himself. So I've been fortunate that I've had opportunities to lecture at Oxford several times. And the times that it's been since COVID, I haven't been to England since COVID, but every time I'd go to Oxford, I had to go to the Eagle and the Child. And I remember the first time I went there, I was fortunate that I could sit in the actual booth where the Inklings would regularly meet. And to me, that was part of the whole package for me, was not just the books, but this idea of these professors that, since I'm a professor myself, that would gather together and hash over their stories and have a sort of kind of camaraderie. They'd meet on a weekly basis. I really wanted to be part of that group. I felt a real pleasure saying, I'm sitting at the exact same table that they sat at, and there was Humphrey Carpenter wrote a book called The Inklings, and I enjoyed reading that.
Yes.
Because I felt like that sense of camaraderie amongst the writers themselves was appealing to me. And I think in some ways, when I read the books, I think about that as well. And just wandering the streets of Oxford and thinking about what it would be like to be a professor there. And then reading about the relationship between C.S. Lewis and Tolkien is really kind of interesting, because they were so close, and yet they took such a different approach to the writing, but they were both scholarly, learned men who took an interest in writing fantasy stories in different directions. And comparing, I don't participate in those big fantasy conventions anymore. I'm just too old to deal with all the crowds. But I remember I gave I participated in a presentation at Dragon Con that was about religion as it related to Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. That room was packed, and it was just I was just amazed at how. I mean, everybody said, "Will those panelists please shut up, because I have something I want to say." But they were just primed and ready to go. So it was an interesting experience, but it again brought in the authors. There's something weirdly appealing about the authors themselves, at least to me. That's, to me, part of the fandom is is the authors and their lives, their biographies, like you were talking about, in terms of his experience in World War I and how formative that was, his education, his fascination with Norse mythology and dead languages and the old Norse myths. Those are things that it's interesting that how he got into all of that. So that's part of it.
Well, and that kind of takes me down one place that I was hoping to go, which everybody here is a writer, is how our life experiences, how our knowledge, how everything really comes in and influences our work. And if we take a look, I think there's a really good example here of, if we look at Tolkien and look at loss of his mother at a young age, we look at the influence of World War I. You can see trench warfare throughout Lord of the Rings. You look at the Two Towers, you look at the fall of Arya at Helm Deep, and you look at this is bloody hand-to-hand warfare. It's definitively there and obviously an influence. If we look at disease, if we look at corruption, if we look at the destruction of centuries of history, all of this makes its way from his personal experience into fundamentally the stories that we know, we see, we love, and have made it to film. And so as authors, as creators, we have to acknowledge our experience and know that a lot of the time it's what we're processing that makes it into that work. So is there anything, when you look at things from a writer perspective, from a creator perspective, and I think that Mark, your point here about looking at the fact that C.S. Lewis and Tolkien were both writing kind of their seminal works at the same time and discussing this, sitting in the pub, the great arguments and discussions that go on, to look at how both of them approached a lot of religion, faith, belief systems, and dogma, and how differently the two of them pursued it, I think is a great lesson for writers that all go and say, well, I don't want to give up an idea. It's not the idea, it's how you execute on it. And I think this is a great lesson we can take from that. So is there something about Tolkien, his history, his life, his background, that really speaks to you and how it translated into the work itself? So anybody want to take that one first?
I would like to talk about how, like you said, I've read C.S. Lewis, the Perelandra trilogy, and my favorite, The Great Divorce. But and of course I've read Tolkien, and one of the things we talked about, I was exposed to it early on in that class, is the lack of organized religion in the Lord of the Rings. Yes, they were it seemed like most of them were a very spiritual, whether they were good spiritual or bad spiritual. There was palpable good and evil in Middle Earth, but you didn't have an organized religion. Whereas C.S. Lewis wore his religion on his sleeve.
Right.
However, I did in the paper I had to write, because you always have to write a paper in college. I addressed my mind was on free will in Middle Earth. The question of whether it was whether Frodo was destined to take the ring, or did it just happen? And as an aside, when I mentioned there's no evidence of that there's no organized religion in Middle Earth, I happened to notice in Tolkien's genealogy in the back that one of Frodo and Bilbo's ancestors was named Bingo. And so I argued that was evidence of at least one time there was Catholicism.
And I was trying to go back to my notes, because that was one of those things that and I had forgotten about this until I was prepping for this a little bit today, was the fact that I believe C.S. Lewis was actually an atheist up until Tolkien talked him into conversion.
It's a great story.
And I had entirely forgotten about that. I was trying to go back to find the notes as to when it happened. But was the fact that one of the great rivalries happened not because he came to Christianity, but was that it was the wrong flavor.
Yes. And Tolkien actually had some begrudging against Lewis because Lewis was able to write much faster than Tolkien was. I think The Hobbit came out someone needs to help me. But The Hobbit came out, and then there was a very long period before The Lord of the Rings came out. C.S. Lewis was able
to out in 54 and then 55.
Right. C.S. Lewis was able to produce Narnia and a large amount of work in a short amount of time, including things like the Screw Tape Letters, a lot of his apologetics. And Tolkien wasn't necessarily comfortable with, not only Lewis becoming a Protestant, but also some of the subject of the Screw Tape Letters. One thing in Humphrey Carpenter's biography on Tolkien is that he notes that Tolkien had a little bit of a grudge against Lewis because he felt Lewis may not have been completely sincere because, this guy goes from being an atheist to suddenly writing apologetics. There is a real tension between the two, but there was also this enduring friendship, like Mark mentioned earlier, that really you can't separate the two and have a complete story of both authors.
Apologies, gang. I didn't lose interest. I just had an internet problem over here and a crash.
Oh.
So I do want to kind of it did. And Beth, I don't know if you, Mark, anybody had anything else you wanted to add on to that piece or not.
I just wanted to say that I read all of the Chronicles of Narnia when I was a boy. When I was junior high school. We used to have junior high school. Remember before they've been fiddling around with how they organize schools over the years, and I didn't find them annoying. I liked the stories and whatnot. And then I read them as a college student and I disliked them because it seemed like, stop preaching to me. I'm tired. Okay, I get it. He's Christ. I understand that. But come on, let's get on with the story. I'm tired of all this allegory. But I didn't really see the allegory or care much about it when I was a boy. I just kind of went along for the story. But it really offended me when I was, a young man. And then we read the stories aloud to our son when he was young, and we didn't raise him religiously, but he was there for the ride as well. But I did think that the way in which the two authors dealt with religion in their fiction is really interesting in terms of Tolkien being more subtle, a little bit more in the background, as you were suggesting, rather than this kind of like A stands for B and C stands for D and all that kind of stuff, which still annoys me as an adult. So.
One thing, if I could add, I don't know who mentioned about Tolkien and how Norse myths and all that influenced him. About
Mark.
A couple months ago, I was in a brand new bookstore on Harford Road in Baltimore. And as you know, it's bad luck going to a bookstore for the first time and not buy anything. And I happened to find an encyclopedia of Tolkien by David Day, in which you've read it. Yeah, it's a marvelous book, and it doesn't do more than just, say, well, an orc is this and all that. It gets into the Norse myths, Norse myths, and the other impossible influences that Tolkien could have drawn from when he was writing Lord of the Rings. Plus, it's a pretty book.
Yeah.
I'm curious because I'm not a fiction writer. I've never written fiction. My writing is generally scholarly writing or nonfiction for a general audience. I don't always write for academic audiences. In fact, I write for academic audiences less and less in my old age. But from a fiction writer's point of view, I'm curious because most of you do write fiction. I don't. But what impact Tolkien has on your own fiction? I mean, what inspires fiction writers about him, half a century after, more than half a century after The Lord of the Rings was published?
Well, he does encourage you to break a lot of rules. For example, like point of view rules. There are things such as the Frodo and his companions are leaving the Shire, and a fox comes across them, and it's like, here are a couple of hobbits sleeping outside, and he never learned any more about it. The average editor would just reach through the screen and murder you if you did anything like that. And in fact, Tom Bombadil, the asides that occur in this book would not be allowed in modern writing. So he does encourage you to go, but Tolkien did it and got away with it. And, he is sort of maybe the exception that proves the rule in that regard.
And
it could be that there were no rules at the time for what Tolkien was writing.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
But, now I like crime, I write pulp, I do some horror. The fantasy the little bit of fantasy I do write is not necessarily Tolkien, but I think the themes, the themes that Tolkien had in there, how the least important person can become the most important person. And there is a lot of, shall we say, sin and redemption in Tolkien. Who was my mind's blanking, but who was it who tried to get the ring from Frodo?
Boromir.
Yeah, Gollum.
Or
a number of people tried to get the ring.
Yeah, but Boromir, and how Boromir realized what he did, and he wound up redeeming himself.
In fact, Gandalf says that Boromir escaped at the end. He escaped honorable death.
And Gollum, in a way, redeemed himself at the end, even though through a bizarre set of circumstances. It was his ultimate unwilling sacrifice that saved everything. That in the whole, it's like, it's basically, and there's a lot of sin and redemption in my books. People, people who have done bad things and have, trying to make up for it, or other people who, who are trying to lead people to redemption. It's the unlikely hero.
I have to say,
John, your answer. Oh, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I was speaking. Go ahead.
I was going to say, John's answer is interesting because when Mark was asking the question, Boromir was the first person I thought of, because I think of all the characters in The Lord of the Rings, Boromir is probably the one I've read the most commentaries on, because people really like to delve into him being tempted by the ring and how, well, does this make him a bad person, or does it just make him human? And so I think that's a valuable lesson for me as a writer, that the most interesting characters are the ones who have a lot of gray area and who make mistakes, because a villain who's always a villain is boring, and a good guy who's always a good guy is equally boring. And you need to have that mix. You need to have people who stumble and fall, or the villain who unexpectedly does something nice for a change. So I think that's a great lesson as a writer, that you have to give characters that depth and a little bit of that unpredictability.
In that regard, Gollum is kind of that character, and particularly when Andy Serkis portrayed him, you really felt the sympathy for this poor creature, and the times that he's almost breaking away from the precious, you want him to escape. As much of a villain as he is, you look at him and think, 500 years of being tormented by the ring, and who deserves that? He's the most pitiable, and as you said, in some respects, the most heroic character, even if it's an inadvertent heroism. He is the one that destroys the ring. he's the one that plunges into it. The ring betrays him for that one last time. But the Circus's presentation of Gollum succeeded where actually Tolkien didn't quite. I was never sympathetic to Gollum. I was like, stab him, kill him already. And then when I saw him and as he was portrayed, particularly in those pathetic little moments where he was almost a person again, I really, really felt for him. And I felt both conflicted about it and very sorry that he ended the way that he did. Though, what other way could he have ended, I suppose?
Well, I think your point, Elizabeth, about the gray areas is one of the things that Tolkien, I think, did better than C.S. Lewis. But C.S. Lewis does the gray areas too in some of his characters. I'm thinking in terms of his children's characters, but I agree with you about that. I think that's one of, that you do see that in some of his books, some of his characters. So, I never really warmed to Gandalf. Gandalf was, he's just, some guy puffing a pipe. Oh, never mind. But
nothing personal, Jay.
The question was, what was he puffing in the pipe?
But he didn't seem quite as relatable. But the characters that have flaws or that have their own internal demons or that have to wrestle with things like we all do, makes them more interesting for a reader.
I actually would go so far as to say I actually find Gollum to be one of the most fascinating characters because Gollum almost sums up the story because it's all about power and corruption and trying to seek redemption when you are inevitably drawn to the darkness. And I think that there's this really interesting watch as he's trying to redeem himself as if you've been there for 500 years, been in a position of being alone, being ostracized, being basically the madman out in the wilderness, and someone shows you kindness and that internal conflict of, can you believe it? Can you not? And I think that Gollum often is that tragic figure that shows corruption and shows conflict, that internal conflict in a way that you don't see very often. And that is one of the things that I really have been fascinated by.
It also makes Frodo, sorry.
No, sorry, go ahead.
It also makes Frodo's story much more impactful in terms of him being a greater hero than Bilbo is. Bilbo throughout The Hobbit rejects Gollum, treats Gollum like the creature that he sees before him, of course, because Gollum is threatening to eat him. But if you follow the books and then especially the movies, Frodo's kindness to Gollum is truly one of the things that is transformative for that character that you've all mentioned previously. I think that the kindness that Frodo shows is such an important part of why that character ends up working as well as it does, especially in the movies, that, I think that kind of concurrent theme of compassion and kindness is also something that you just find running throughout Tolkien.
And Gollum actually still has a choice for good or evil. Some of the forces of evil, the orcs, are kind of meat puppets. They don't seem to have the option to turn to good. Humans, hold the balance in the book. We can go good or evil. Elves are usually good unless they fall from pride. But Gollum is essentially one of us. He can choose good. He's gone far down the path of addiction and madness, but he can see the light back there. And every once in a while, he starts heading back that way. And you start rooting for him, just like you would a drug addict that is, turned back and is trying to make something of himself. That's where I think he is, as you say, in many respects, the most compelling character, because he's the most far gone, but still aware of his own potential for goodness. He still remembers the sun on water. He still remembers the cool breeze in his face. And in some respects, it would almost be better for him if he didn't.
Yeah. One thing that struck me, I was I saw the first 3 episodes of Star Wars, which also tell a story of a good person who was corrupted by evil. And after I saw the 3rd one, my first thought was, we need to make George Lucas read Lord of the Rings and go back.
Yeah.
Well, and
You know, because
there is some interesting analysis that actually overlays the story told in Star Wars to the story 4, 5, and 6 to the story that is told in Lord of the Rings. So there's an interesting actually overlay between the two, on top of Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey and all the rest of that. But there are some actual interesting studies that have been done that overlay the two different stories and the comparative story.
Well, I think for a lot of people today, Peter Jackson's version of The Lord of the Rings. I love Peter Jackson's version of Lord of the Rings, and I did not like his version of The Hobbit. I just felt like he did a disservice to The Hobbit.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And made Hobbit ponderous, and it's not supposed to be ponderous. But he tried to add something to it that really wasn't part of the book, in my opinion. But I loved how he handled Lord of the Rings, but also the sets. Seeing your set there, Jim, with Hobbiton, with the round door and everything, when the movies first came out, Air New Zealand was running pictures of Hobbit stuff on the tails of its planes. It was something appealing about the world. Like suddenly New Zealand became Middle Earth. How did that happen? But it sort of did. And they've kept those sets. Those movies were made a while ago now. They still kept those sets.
All those extras from Xena had to go somewhere to work.
Yeah.
Well, and this is kind of one of the places I wanted to go as we're starting to go towards wrapping up, is now we've seen how a lot of different people have interpreted and taken Tolkien's work. Peter Jackson, the interpretations. I want to talk about the films first. And then we've got this upcoming Amazon series. So we've got a lot of people whose entire fandom of Middle Earth is based around just the films.
I'm also a big fan of the video games. I think those should be mentioned too, because there's a huge fan base out there that plays things like Shadows of Mordor, Shadows of War, Lord of the Rings Online. A lot of people are baked into the fandom now because of those games.
I would agree. I mean, we see that there's a lot of things, because there were even the games back in the 70s and 80s, some of the early RPG stuff that was done before that TSR Dungeons and Dragons.
Actually, I had Lord of the Rings Risk.
Mm-hmm.
Ooh.
Actually threw the dice yourself, huh?
Yes.
So when you look at the films, let's actually go to the films. And so we were talking about the Lord of the Rings trilogy. How does everybody feel about that one?
There is only one movie that I've ever seen, going to the theater to see, on the first day it was released, and that was Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Rings. And when I got home, I immediately emailed my friend Tom, who was as big a Lord of the Rings fan as I was, and simply emailed him, they got it right.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, you waited until Lord of the Rings, till the next movie came out. If I had gone to, if at the Fellowship of the Ring, somebody told me that the Two Towers was playing 500 miles away, I would have gotten in my car and driven to go see it. That's how much I loved the first, the Lord of the Rings trilogy as a movie. I'm still waiting for Peter Jackson. You know how they do the extended version of movies? Mm-hmm. I'm still hoping that Peter Jackson does the cut down version of The Hobbit, taking 3 movies and turning them into maybe a nice 3.5 hour version of it.
So hyper fan here. There is actually a cut out there of The Hobbit that someone did independently of Jackson, which cuts it all down to one film. You can actually go and download it for free on the internet.
I'm gonna have to look for that.
There's also the extended version of The Hobbit, which I have to say, being I actually do like the Hobbit Extended Edition. The Hobbit Extended Edition actually fleshes some things out and makes it a much better film. But there is a cut out there of The Hobbit that is basically boiled down to one film, and it's great.
Have to look for that. Is it on YouTube?
I think it is on YouTube. It might be on Vimeo as well.
Okay. I have to look for that. Oh, speaking of a Hobbit on YouTube, the original Hobbit movie with Orson Welles as Bilbo is also in its entirety on YouTube.
Orson Bean, but yes.
Orson Bean, yes. I would have much rather seen Orson Welles. But,
well, yes, there you go.
Best soundtrack.
As is the LP Poem and Songs from Middle Earth. That's also in its entirety on YouTube.
I just want to see Orson Welles as Gandalf.
We will kill no orc before it's time. For me, the Lord of the Rings,
I saw Sauron.
yeah, this was the best book to movie adaptation that I had ever seen. Even where he does away with things or would change. For example, the character Glorfindel disappears and the role is largely given to Arwen. Even Star works. The wretched excess that Peter Jackson was later capable of was restrained in the movie. And some things like the Mountain of Skulls that pour on people and in the City of the Dead didn't make it into the live movie. And that was a good thing. When he added to the Lord of the Rings, it was very iffy at best. When he edited it, he did a wonderful job of selecting, moving dialogue around, moving characters, in my opinion.
Well, he did. He really captured the world building. I mean, I think because he made surprisingly limited use of CGI. I mean, he did use CGI, and we certainly see that with Gollum and whatnot. But he actually built sets and costumes, and it gave it a rich texture that these damn CGI movies. Oh, I shouldn't have said that. These darn CGI movies don't have. They just look flat to me in terms of their appearance. I really miss the days of models and sets. You know, the old science fiction where they would, you know, like even old Star Wars, where they would actually have models of everything and sets of everything, and they weren't just all on green screens. That was, to me, that really, it added to the richness. I was really glad that he did that. And it gave the movie I felt like I was in Middle Earth. And I think to some degree the geography of New Zealand worked with that, with the mountain ranges and the forests and the old the old big old trees and such. He made good use of that. So I like that. Has anybody ever seen Peter Jackson's documentary about World War I called They Shall Not Grow Old?
Yes.
Yeah.
I thought he just did a fantastic job with that. And I think in some ways, in terms of his understanding of World War I and kind of in his bones, really, maybe gives him some ability to translate Tolkien, because as we've all said, World War I was so formative for him.
And I would tend to believe I would tend to believe that his research into that is what led into that documentary is also part of what we saw translate into the world the same way we did, because I think he had that same sort of a vision that Tolkien walked into when he was writing these stories, the things that he had walked through to have some of that.
May I make an argument for Peter Jackson's sake for a second? The Hobbit was originally supposed to be directed by Guillermo del Toro, who kind of dropped out at the last minute. Originally, Guillermo del Toro actually did have a lot of practical effects and real special effects lined up. When Jackson came on, as Ed and many other people have noticed, he really did add on to it, and he basically produced the entire film on a green screen stage. So, you know, I think the differences between the passion and the time that he put into the original trilogy was just not able to be translated into The Hobbit, because I think he was probably crunched for time.
And budgets.
Yeah, and budgets.
Yeah.
Well, and
Any-
writing, one could forgive certain things, but then there were the
Right.
gross, additions such as the
Right.
flume ride with the orcs jumping in and
Oh.
people turning barrels into suits of armor. So don't get me started.
So anything,
Well,
so
I will
Beth,
say the one addition I really liked, although I should not have, was the sled pulled by hares.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd like to see that in a different movie, but that was just fun. That and the battle ram.
So Beth,
Yeah.
anything on your side from the films?
Well, about 6 years ago, my mother, my aunt, and I went to New Zealand and did a 2-week driving tour to see the various Lord of the Rings filming sites. And to give you an idea of how much I love the movies, I cried when we were in Hobbiton. So it was just amazing to be there. Like, this is it. This is actually Hobbiton, and there's Bag End. So yeah, I think I think I love the books and the movies equally, but differently. And they both have their strengths and weaknesses.
And using was it Alan Lee's iconography and visual take on Middle Earth, I think made the Lord of the Rings films so much stronger. Because as you said, you do get tired of the CGI and the green screen, but merely doing it with sets doesn't necessarily help. I was watching the first episode of The Wheel of Time, and I thought it just looks like a Renaissance festival, and actually not as good as the one here in North Carolina. So yeah,
It looks like Hercules.
Yeah, you almost expect to see Joxer wandering around. It was
Yes.
impressive.
Well, and that kind of carries to one of the last things I want to touch on a little bit is Amazon is now bringing forth their TV series. Jay, we were talking about beforehand a little bit about kind of the limitations and the rules that Amazon's playing with. You want to kind of hit on those real quick?
So I think one thing that we have to acknowledge is that there's been a lot of debate already about the new Amazon series in terms of what's going to be brought in, what's going to be left out, some of the things that will be incorporated that maybe appeal to modern audiences. But I think that we have to recognize that Amazon spent a lot of money getting these rights from the Tolkien estate, and the Tolkien estate actually set some pretty strict guidelines, including insisting that the main shape of the Second Age will not be altered during the show. So during the Second Age, Sauron invades Eriador, is forced back by the Númenóreans, and then is, of course, returned to Númenor, where he corrupts them and seduces them to break the ban of the Valar. This history has to remain the same for the show, but they can, ask questions around that and play with the characters around that. Also, apparently, the estate set some pretty firm guidelines on when the show could take place. So the reason it's taking place in the Second Age is because the Tolkien estate has said that the first and third ages are off limits. They can't have the first age and they can't have the third, because those are primarily places that the Tolkien estate does not want touched, because they did not like the original Jackson trilogy in terms of either The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings. So what we're going to see going forward is going to be, in a sense, built around Tolkien's outline of the Second Age, but that's really all we're going to be able to see. If we see anything from the First Age, they might show it, but they have to be very careful. But we're not going to see anything from the Second Age. I don't think we're going to see Gandalf. We might see the Blue Wizards, stuff like that.
Now, do you think that will help, as far as a second season? You think a lot of people who have just seen the movies will look at this and go, hey, where are the hobbits? Where's Gandalf? Or, that sort of thing?
Elves, yeah.
I think the bigger concern that the fandom that I've seen on the internet have is whether or not this show is going to look a lot like Game of Thrones.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of debate right now about are they going to have nudity on the show? And I think that conversation has kind of gotten muddied in terms of can we show sex? Would Tolkien approve of sex? It's very clear in the stories that people are having children, people are getting married. So of course, characters are having sex. the idea of seeing elves and humans canoodling is probably not going to be that crazy. I think the thing that people are worried about is seeing kind of the luridness and the violence and kind of the slapdash nature that you saw in Game of Thrones paid to this franchise and this fantasy. And I don't think people really want to see that. I think they want that hopeful tone. I think they really want to see something that is, like Mark has mentioned, and John, and of course Ed and Beth and you Jim, they really want to go to Middle Earth. They don't want to go to Westeros remasked as Middle Earth.
I don't
So I
want it
think
to turn
that's-
into I don't want it to turn into a grim dark series. You know, as I was just making a note on The Witcher, it's like, I don't care about the fight between Requard, Splashguard, and Midgard here. It's like they all seem
Yes.
awful people. They could all drop, as far as I'm concerned. While I'm not childlike enough to believe completely in good guys and bad guys, I want to have somebody to root for. If they're all these evil, horrible people, it's like there's got to be something else I can watch.
And so this does bring one thing I did want to throw out there is, since this is an Amazon series and they are putting what, 450 million behind it, for
more
465, something like that. It was
this is going to, by the time this is all said and done, this is going to be upwards of $500 million.
right. And I mean, they were putting 10 million an episode behind Wheel of Time.
Yes.
So, when you look at and compare the numbers, it's got a much greater budget. Do you think we're going to see something that's a better product than Wheel of Time? And do you think it's going to have that kind of return?
It better be.
I think that's all going to depend on the story.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
the best special effects in the world can't save a bad story. And I think, like Jay was saying, many of us still want those themes of hope and kindness. We don't want it just to be dark and violent and dramatic for the sake of being shocking and something to talk about on Monday morning at the office.
Yeah, I am both looking forward to this production and dreading it.
Mm.
Agreed.
Basically the same way I approach anything I like. When A&E started doing its Nero Wolfe series, I had flashbacks to when Robert Conrad played Wolfe, which wasn't bad, which wasn't that good. It wasn't as good as it could have been. But again, when I saw the first, when I think it was the Golden Spiders, which was the first episode, I'm just looking at Wolfe's office and again thinking, damn, they got it right. And I'm really hoping I have that same experience when I know it's called Lord of the Rings, but there is a subtitle to it.
Oh, the Nine Rings of Power.
Okay.
So we're definitely going to see Sauron and Celebrimbor forge the nine rings that are given to the nine kings of men, warriors and sorcerers and legends of old.
Galadriel is there.
Yes, Galadriel.
Elrond is there. So some of the characters that we've met before. You could get Legolas. I think he was around. I'm not sure exactly how.
Durin is going to make an appearance. So we're going to see the king of kings among the dwarves. So I think we're going to actually be introduced a lot to dwarven culture in a way that we haven't seen. And we're actually going to see dwarven women for the first time, which I'm very excited about.
We'll see.
Well,
I think that this is pushing, I think if this show is successful, it's good for fantasy, and anything that's good for fantasy, I think is just great for us.
Yeah, I agree. And as you say, John, you're just sort of sitting there with fingers and toes crossed.
Right.
Absolutely.
But I think one of the things we all have to do, something that we care deeply about, is give the producers, the writers, a fair shot. Sometimes they'll come up with something that's different from what we would come up with, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not worth watching. So, I think I always try to be more open-minded about things and say, okay, well, how do they go about it? And does it work for me? Sometimes, one of the movies that I like is Field of Dreams. And I've always liked that movie. And so I read the book that it's based on. It's one of the very few times in my life where when I read the book, I said, boy, the movie's a hell of a lot better.
Yeah.
The African Queen, the African Queen would
stumbles
be the other
around,
one.
and it's like, boy,
Yeah.
they took that book, lots of little elements from it, and turned it into this masterful movie. But the book really, I mean, it's interesting, but it's just it's not the it doesn't transport you the way the movie does. So, maybe they'll do a great job with it. I don't know.
I had that same experience. I had seen Little Big Man in the theater.
Mhm.
And then I got the book from the library, and oh boy, did I like the movie so much better.
I think as
Well,
Beth says, it's all going to come down to story. Do they have something to say? And do they do it in a compelling fashion?
Well, I think that that's a good spot to wrap this one up on, since we've kind of gone Hobbit length. But I appreciate everybody taking the time to come and hang out tonight and listen and go through, I think, a really good discussion on Tolkien, the work, and a world we all love. I mean, that there's a reason that it's carrying this kind of endurance for this period of time. And there's a lot of things here to love in this world. But before we get out of here, I do want to go back around, let everybody know where to find you: website, social media, where to go get that latest copy of the book. So Ed, we're going to work backwards. How about you?
Sounds good. Thank you. You can find me on Facebook. I'm with Copper Dog Publishing. I've been with a couple of other small publishers. All my work is available on Amazon and Audible. We're working on getting more and more of the books done over to that. So look for Was Once a Hero or For My Outcast State, the beginning books in both my series.
John?
Okay. You can find me on Facebook. You can follow me on BookBub. I just joined that. You can email me, jfrenchfam@aol.com. My two newest books are Mortal Sins, collection of collection of stories about a forensic investigator for Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office, and Frankenstein, Monsters of the Abyss, written with Patrick Thomas. It's a new telling of Frankenstein story from multiple points of view, and we put in all the things we think Mary Shelley left.
Mark?
Well, I don't write fiction, but I have two books coming out soon. One of which kind of relates to this. It's called Storybook Worlds Made Real. It's an edited book that I worked with on a longtime colleague of mine. It's about places, a little bit like what you were talking about in terms of going to New Zealand and seeing Hobbiton and feeling like, oh my goodness, there's this world and I can wander in it and I can open up the green door. But Storybook Worlds Made Real is about places that are based on stories that people have built. And I wrote chapters on Hans Christian Andersen and places in Denmark, and Astrid Lindgren. I'm a big fan of Astrid Lindgren, and Stockholm and Vimmerby and stuff. I wrote about that. And then for anybody who's really kind of a dry academic like I sometimes am, I have a fascination with Theodore Roosevelt, and I am fascinated by Theodore Roosevelt's passion for reading. And so that just consumed me for quite a while. And I just finished a book called Theodore Roosevelt's Library at Sagamore Hill. His home was called Sagamore Hill. And so I wrote a whole book about Theodore Roosevelt as a reader, how reading influenced his life. And then a big chunk of the book is all the books that he had, compared to like some presidents who haven't read a book. Theodore Roosevelt read a book a day. And really it had a tremendous impact on his presidency and his life. And so that book will be out in June.
Jay?
So I'm J.R.R, author of Epic Fantasy and Sword and Sorcery. You can find me at jrequard.com or on Twitter at jrequard. If you go to subscribepage.com/books for the March Prime, you can download 2 free ebooks today. Thank you for having me.
Well done.
Well done. And Beth?
I don't have the visual component like Jay
I
does.
know.
The best place to find me is just my website, bethdolgner.com. There's links there to all of my social media. You can buy all of my books on Amazon, and you can get the audiobook versions on Audible. My current series is the Eternal Rest Bed and Breakfast Paranormal Cozy Mysteries.
Oh, I like the sound of that.
It's
And
fun. It's a little bit of, it's like Murder, She Wrote, but with ghosts.
Oh, nice.
And I've had the pleasure of being your host tonight, Jim Nettles. You can find me at jamespnettles.com, authoressentials.net, and at the Speculative Fiction Academy as well. And until next time, we will see all of you soon. Thanks for hanging out with us.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
It was fun.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care.